welcome back to Examining Life, a life that's worth living. My name is Amanda. Thank you so much for tuning in today. In this episode, I spoke with Dereck, who was introduced to me by my Airbnb host in Trinidad. Shout out to Lisa Marie. The topics that we discuss include Trinidad's politics, history, and economics. I'm going to release this in two parts. In part one, which is this episode, we discuss history and politics. And part two will focus on economics. I apologize in advance for some of the audio. We had to wear masks due to the mask mandate in Trinidad. So without further ado, part one of my conversation with Dereck. Please describe the Caribbean community, aka CARICOM, and what is Trinidad's role in this alliance?
There were attempts in, I think, the 1960s or so to start what was called the Federation, and Trinidad was supposed to be the seat of the Federation, right, at the main office. For some reason, maybe it was egos or maybe a bit of insularity and stuff, it was pushed, and actually it formed a wedge because between us and Jamaica for a long period of time. So it said it was their backing out because they probably weren't happy with Trinidad being the seat of this whole thing. I came in on a shared nationalist point of view because we would have both been made independent in 1962, both Jamaica and Trinidad, and our then leaders were looking to push nationalization. So they were converting some of the British companies, and all this was seen, a part of it, as, okay, we're in the Commonwealth, but we're no longer a ward of England. So as a community which shares a lot of the same problems, I mean, each island is different, but there's some commonalities, right? We needed to develop our own community, our own markets. We're close to the US, the South America as a market, but individually we don't have enough because all the Caribbean islands are relatively small by comparison. So it's found that I think there are 15 member states of CARICOM and I think 5 other associate states, which is made up of all the countries, or most of the countries in the Caribbean, including Haiti and as far as Bahamas, right? The associate states. And those make up CARICOM, and what they meet twice a year to discuss is some of the issues that affect the region, how to increase movement, because at one time it wasn't so easy. They made it easy so that a Barbadian or Bajan can come and work without having to jump through all these hoops and all this documentation.
Visas,
can work in, they've more or less removed some of those barriers we used to have. And they've even gone so far to set up our own Caribbean Court of Appeal. And the people who were pushing for the Caribbean Court of Appeal were saying, well, for the British to be ruling on issues happening in your country, we should develop by now our own. And I mean, it's only natural because if you consider, okay, the US is 245 years old, in Caribbean we're only 50 something. It's sometimes unfair we're compared to a first world country, but we're kind of just a toddler as far as independence grows. Some of the challenges we face too as a community is the disasters that happen almost every year. So every year it's tiny somehow in development because you don't know who will be destroyed by a hurricane. So in recent times Jamaica has been seriously hit by Hurricane Dominica a couple of times and stuff like that. So because we share the same kind of existence, CARICOM developed to really deal with some of our common issues, health, education, that sort of thing, because there is, like in the education system, a common exam that all students have to sit at a particular time to get into what is called secondary school and go on and stuff like that. So try to share our knowledge of each other and our experience to progress the whole region.
Yeah. Can you please give me an overview of the coup and what were some prominent ideologies or philosophies that were happening in society that led to a coup occurring?
Well, the coup occurred July 27th of 1990, right, where the Jamaat al-Muslimin, which was a Muslim organization led by their leader, Yassin Abu Bakr, descended upon the seat of parliament, and it also seized the one television station we had and a sister radio station, right? That was a Friday evening at about 6 o'clock, right? To understand the reasons for the coup, we need to go back a little bit. They had occupied a plot of land, right, one Mokrapa Road, and that was probably the spark for the coup, but there were many other issues around. They were granted the land by the government sometime before, right? And then Abu Bakr decided to use the land, like to bring in and develop on the land school, an actual mosque that wasn't finished yet. It was being built, right? And they operated there. The problem with the land issue is subsequently they discovered, and I think they challenged it in court, or court challenged, the fact that they were given the land because they say that they were given it by the state, the central government, when they actually had no right to. It should have been the local government had a right. So that was the beginning of the contention with the land.
Okay.
And over the course of time, well, he resisted. He was actually jailed for a period of time in contempt of court. So there was always a bit of friction between the central government and the Jamaat lead and his followers. Now the other issue too, the Jamaat had become an organization that was almost operating in such a way where in the 1980s you would have had the advent of, let's say, the drug trade now hitting the streets of Trinidad and Tobago, right? Because I think all around this side of the world, I think the 1980s was really the time when the drug trade. So they had become almost a vigilante group, right? Where they would seize drugs and run drug dealers off the drug blocks. It seize guns as well, right? So you found that over time, they continued to operate as a kind of vigilante group that was doing the job that maybe the state was supposed to be doing. I think that would have also given them a sort of accreditation, right? Because they were allowed to continue. A couple of events had happened in 1986, which was 4 years before, when Trinidad had only gotten their second political party, which was the National Alliance for Reconstruction, led by Mr. Robinson. Now, for a long period of time, almost 32 years or 30 odd years, one government, which is the People's National Movement, brought in with the first Prime Minister out of British rule, that was Eric Williams, kind of led the country. And the only other significant party was the ULF, which was kind of came out of the East Indian sector and the former cane farmers and sugar workers. But traditionally, they never presented a real challenge to the government of the day. In '86, however, that changed. So about 3 parties formed an alliance, and they actually defeated the PNM government by 33-3 seats. So
Okay.
they now had the dominant, and it was major significant because even if the PNM saw the signs of losing, they didn't expect to lose at 33-3. There was a new government. I think there was a wave of younger people coming out and wanting to vote and stuff like that. And they would not have had the experience of their parents, where the PNM government kind of led them into independence. This was like the new order. So that was '86. But with that came basically economic downturns throughout the world. So you find now that they were in power, and you had declines with oil production and also the cost of oil, right when they came, in fact, it started just a few years before, they had to implement some stricter, stringent measures. So a lot of the Caribbean countries around that time had gone to the IMF, and therefore there were all these policies you had to institute. So some that they did was they froze the income of the public servants. They had a 10% cut in the wages. They introduced higher taxes, and I think the last straw was the implementation of a value-added tax of 15% on all goods. So, leading up to the coup, there were all these marches and protests, and the Jamaat had also been part of a collective group with the unions, protesting all these strict austerity measures, which was seen as cruel. Then the last thing, possibly, which also gave them, as I said, the feeling that here we should be more or less directly part of this, was there was a huge, the hospitals and so on were suffering, and they couldn't deal with the common man's problems, and the Jamaat installed themselves, and they found that they were feeding, right, so performing social services, dentistry, eyeglass, all those things. So I think on the day or just before, the government would have sent in the army a few times to the Muslim compound, right, to put pressure and try to evict them. They'd also had raids trying to get, well, they would have gotten guns and so on, since they took it from. So they were seen as a threat. But I think the powder keg, the action that set it off, was right then that week. And I think from some of the readings I read after the fact, intelligence did kind of hint to the government of the day. You know, there was a possible risk and this thing was happening. But the then Prime Minister, N.R. Robinson, was like, he was not willing to change. He was like, no, right? I will not change the date and stuff like that because I gave my commitment. I signed to rule this country and I wouldn't let a potential threat derail that. So those were the activities leading up to the coup, but it's called, I mean, it was a coup, but it wasn't successful in removing the government because I think at the end of the day, he didn't get the support. With most coups, the first arm they try to get or control is the army, right? Because that's where you have the force and stuff. And the army never kind of came over to his side because when Robinson was asked to probably give up or have the army come in, he defied them by saying to the army personnel, attack with full force. That was his words. And that led to him being shot in the leg and beaten up and stuff like that. The whole seizure of the nation happened, it took 6 days. So for 6 days, they basically held the nation hostage, as well as all these ministers and the people who were working at the radio and television station.
So after those 6 days, the previous government was reinstated?
Well, the same government was reinstated because what was signed was an amnesty.
Okay.
Right? Because they held the hostages, right? We had an acting president at the time, and he signed an amnesty. So although they surrendered, they didn't face prosecution right away because they had this paper saying, well, we agreed to amnesty for your actions. Now that had been challenged, or that was challenged afterwards, and it went as high as the Privy Council in England, who at the end had thrown out, because at first it was upheld, but then there was an appeal by the government and it was thrown out, but the offenders, the insurgents were never retried. So they just went on with their life.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to part 1, covering Trinidad's history and politics. Stay tuned for part 2 on economics. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.